Welcome to Conversations. My guest today, well, before I introduce him, I would like to tell you how it is that he is here and talking about what we're going to talk about. This is Mr. Gary Hart, and sometime back, before we even started this show, I was having trouble with a friend, and without going into all the details, I had just decided that I was tired of fighting, I was tired of whose fault it was, and I was just going to drop the whole thing and try to go on and be, honor the relationship that I thought we had. And a number of people had told me that I was forgiving this person, and which puzzled me because I didn't think I was forgiving them because I still knew I had some resentments and I still thought they were wrong. I was just trying to go on ahead. And against that background, I ran into Gary one day outside our church, and somehow we got to the fact that he actually teaches or taught a course on forgiveness, and we stood there on the street talking about the ins and outs of forgiveness. And when I started this show, you were one of the people that I have wanted to have on to kind of try to reconstruct that conversation if we can. Before we get into that, let's do a little of the biographical thing. You are an ordained minister.
Yes.
And in what denomination?
In the United Church of Christ.
And how long were you in that?
I was active as a parish minister for about 17 years. First in Northern California, where I had a pair of small churches in the mountains, and then I moved to Helena, Montana, and served the Congregational Church there for 11 years.
And what brought you to Missoula?
The woman who became my wife brought me to Missoula, Joyce Hocker.
I knew that, but I wanted to have you say it.
You wanted to see if I could say it?
Yeah. And Joyce is a psychiatrist?
Psychologist.
And you do counseling with her?
Right. One day a week we work together, and we work with couples.
And I might add you work with some gay couples as well?
Yes, that's right.
You also are a woodworker.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us about that?
Well, I would love to tell you about it, but I know the program's on forgiveness. I'm a custom woodworker and build furniture mostly on commission.
So you make fancy furniture, and people bring their ideas, and you work with them.
Right.
And, okay, and you also preach occasionally.
Yes.
When people need someone to fill in.
Right.
And you teach.
Yes.
At the university.
Right.
When you told me that you taught a course on forgiveness, I was kind of nonplussed. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we could have, like that we could have courses on. Why forgiveness?
A number of years ago, a family from Michigan came out to Montana for their vacation, and they camped at the point where the Three Rivers converged to form the Missouri River at Three Rivers State Park. And while they were there, a man abducted their daughter and later killed her. And the mother of this little girl became very involved with the man who had taken and killed her daughter, and eventually was able to express her forgiveness and compassion toward him. This story so moved one of the people who heard her tell the story that he began working with his small family foundation to fund a class at the University of Montana called Forgiveness and Reconciliation. And this small family trust supports the course that I teach, a recreational program for blind children in Kalispell, and a sabbatical type program for staff at the Intermountain Children's Home, all with the idea of easing human suffering. And this individual felt like forgiveness and reconciliation were means to ease human suffering. And I eventually was asked to begin teaching this course. The first time it was taught by Mary Herrick, who's a professor at Salish Kootenai College.
Can we mention the foundation, or
Yes,
is it
yeah, I don't think that's secret. It's called the Weinrich Family Trust. It's a very small family foundation out of Manhattan, Montana.
that is really impressive. And I didn't know that until you told me just now. When you and I talked, I realized that I didn't really know what forgiveness was, or I thought I did.
Mm-hmm.
And did you said the other day on the phone you had a new definition or a definition ready?
Well, I don't know if it's the final definition, but
no, nothing is.
yeah, there's a great deal of interest in this whole field. Friends were telling me that at the recent American Psychological Association annual meeting, a lot of attention was focused on the matter of forgiveness, and I'm seeing more in the literature. The particular definition that I find helpful grows out of some of that literature, and it affirms that forgiveness is a decision to reduce negative feelings like the resentment you mentioned earlier and negative behavior, all with an eye toward gaining a greater understanding of the offense that took place and the offender. Now that's a fairly complex definition. It's speaking to the fact that people make decisions and they have choices about whether or not to forgive. It acknowledges the often intense feelings associated with a transgression or a violation of some sort, or a kind of alienation between or among people. And it also acknowledges that forgiveness entails a lengthy process by which people come to understand themselves, perhaps their own participation in an event, as well as the person or people who hurt them, and what all of that might mean in their lives. So those are some of the factors in forgiveness, and they influence the definition. Now, this particular definition places the emphasis on decision, and one of the things I'm finding now is that some people are saying that it's important to begin the process with forgiveness itself. I tend to take the point of view that forgiveness is more a process than a decision, and that very often people make a discovery down the line that they have forgiven a person or a group of people who have hurt them. That discovery comes later in the process.
I think sometimes you can make the decision, be unaware that you've made the decision, and then later realize that somewhere back there you lost some of the resentment
Right.
or something. One thing that comes to mind, since that definition is so lengthy and a bit complicated, is should we be talking about forgiveness for small things, slights, road rage? I mean, it seems to me that there are things that happen during the day with people that come into our lives and they're not a big part of it, and some of us can just blow it off and some of us can't. Now, there's an element in there of forgiveness, isn't there, on that level?
Yes, I think so. I think that the energy that swirls around the effort to forgive is greater in situations where we know the person who has hurt us. And so I'm thinking, for example, of some of my students and the stories that they tell me, or the stories that emerge from their writings. And in situations where someone has been physically or sexually abused or betrayed or violated in some other profound way by someone they know, the process becomes much more difficult than in a situation like road rage where someone cuts us off at a stoplight. I don't want to minimize the feelings that might be present there, but they are very far-reaching when it's someone that we know well, and especially if it's someone whom we trusted.
That was the point I was sort of going at, that forgiveness usually involves people that we have loved and cared for and
Yeah.
trusted, and that makes it a very difficult and complicated thing to deal with. Let's go back to the specific, which is long gone, but according to that definition, my having made the choice to lessen or try to lessen tensions is an act of forgiveness, even though I still felt I was holding on to. Would the goal of forgiveness be to get beyond those feelings?
I think the way I would put it is that the goal of forgiveness is to move through the feelings. You're not exactly implying this, but what I'm trying to say is that it's important not to skip over the feelings. That sometimes people need to honor their own visceral experience enough to move through the feelings. In my class, I present a very helpful article that appeared a while back in the Utne Reader, and the author of this article does a wonderful job describing how when we are first hurt by someone, we have this sense of injured innocence. The world that we thought we lived in turns out not to be the world we actually live in. Things are not always fair, and that's shaking of the foundations. But then it's natural for us to go into a period of what she calls obsession, where we rehearse in our mind and in our bodies the very thing that happened to us that we found so troubling. And we cycle through that over and over, almost in the same fashion as a grief reaction. And that, like grief, needs not to be rushed or pushed or skipped in some way, but moved through with a sense of grace and patience.
If I forgive someone, is the forgiveness for myself or for them? I mean, what about if I forgive people from my past and I have no way of getting in touch with them?
Yeah.
Then it must be for myself. That would be the only reason to do it if I can't get in touch with them. And is that true even when the person is there, that you're doing it for yourself? Or?
Greg, I think that's such a good question and a great rhetorical question, really. I think that very often forgiveness is for ourselves, and people forgive sometimes without going through the process of an actual conversation with the person who hurt them. So a psychologist would say that's an intra-psychic process of forgiveness within the person, and it doesn't necessarily grow out of interaction and conversation. One of the interesting things is that there's coming to be more and more research directed toward the relationship between forgiveness and health. And scientists are trying to track the physiological changes in the body associated with forgiveness, realizing that it can very much be an internal process, and it can contribute to one's healing.
Oh, I know when I let go of things, it feels so good. Or
Yeah.
if I make up with someone, I actually have a physical sense of,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know. Let's talk about those. I hadn't even thought about that because, I don't know, it's not on my screen very much, but you've mentioned child abuse to me several times. And does that come up in your classes?
It does.
Obviously, it's not a special case, but if anyone's out there,
Sure.
could you address?
Well, yes, I can speak to that briefly. I haven't kept a record of this, but the frequency with which students have experienced childhood abuse is astonishing. And I don't pull for information about that in my class. I don't ask people to tell me their personal stories in the class, but those stories come out during their writing, when they write essays or final papers, and that's where I realized both how common and how devastating this is. I do deal with the subject directly in the course through some of the essays, articles, and poems that I assign students to read. I especially like a couple of poems by Mary Oliver, the poem Rage, in which she acknowledges what I think was probably abuse from her father, and a subsequent poem called The Visitor, in which she imagines this man returning and knocking on her door in the middle of the night. She goes downstairs, greets him at the door, and from the perspective and vantage point of adulthood, looks on her father and suddenly, with compassion, sees the humanity in this broken man who broke her as a child. So I use literature as a powerful way to approach this subject, powerful because it's indirect and artistic more than head-on.
Suppose I say to you that some things are just unforgivable, child abuse. Is there, because it is for yourself to ascend, in a sense, is it better to dwell on, better to try to forgive than to dwell with the unforgiven, I guess?
Well, if someone were to tell me that they had experienced something that was unforgivable, I would not try to talk them out of that point of view. At the same time, what I believe is that when a person's energy is focused on their victimhood, far fewer choices become available to them. Their energy is tied up in that sense of having been a victim, and it's not available for much more creative things. And so I would hope that a person could eventually come to that realization that it's not always in their best interest to stay focused on what was done to them.
By the same token, I think you said to me that it is not necessary, always necessary or even wise for the abused person to go back to the parent or the
Right.
rapist or whatever.
Right.
Although the woman you talked about in that opening story did go to her,
Yeah.
the murderer of her daughter.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. It's not always wise to go back. It's not always safe to go back. And we find that especially true in cases of domestic violence. And so I don't push people to do that.
Is there a way of knowing when you're genuinely forgiving and when you're just being condescending, or is it perhaps you're trying to forgive and it comes out
Yeah, that's really a great danger, and I think when people forgive in a condescending manner, the person who may have hurt the first person recognizes that condescension immediately. And forgiveness does not come from a stance of moral superiority. It comes from the realization that the person who has been hurt and the offender have a kind of common humanity. That's where forgiveness springs from, that realization, not from one of moral superiority. I deign to forgive you.
I often find that if I blame someone and have these resentments, that it's possible, especially in relationships that are rather deep, that at some point I realized that it was my fault or that I had misunderstood it. I don't know what to say to that. Is it all right to forgive yourself? Do you apologize for creating such a fuss when you finally realize that you were the one who who did it? Do you ask them to forgive you? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that this matter of self-forgiveness is maybe even more complex and difficult than the forgiveness of someone else. And I watch my students struggle with this terribly. People say who have been involved in a crime or in wartime situations, again, it's easy to get stuck in the belief that what we have done is unforgivable, and once again, a person's energy is not free for more creative things. But again, that can be a very long process, coming to self-forgiveness.
I was in a group just last night, and there were two people who were, I think, just super efficient, good at what they do, and they revealed that they both, that was an overcompensation for feeling that they weren't good enough. And it's, I'm going, goodness, you know. And it seems to me, thinking about that, there's an element of forgiveness there, isn't there?
Well, to the extent that I understand what you're describing, what I'm struck by is the consciousness on the part of these people, their own awareness of their own lives, and how they've made an adaptation in the form of competency for, on the inside, feeling less adequate than they would like to. And their self-awareness about that seems quite remarkable.
But it just seems to me like, you know, forgive yourself. I mean, goodness, I mean, how much feedback do you need to get? How many awards do you need to win? And
I think that illustrates how difficult it can be. We can say, forgive yourself till the cows come home, but until a person makes that inward decision to admit that, him or herself, our words are in the wind.
Can two people work at forgiveness together?
Oh, yes, yes. In the work that Joyce and I do with couples, we often find that with couples, that they may together acknowledge ways in which they have hurt each other and find ways to acknowledge that hurt rather than minimize it, and through kindness toward each other begin to soften the damage all the way around.
So it isn't so important to always be right?
No,
Because
no,
you
I
might
don't
be
think
wrong,
so.
but
That's right. Yeah.
to, you know, if you have a bad spell in a relationship or something, to the two of you work together on
Yes.
that. I'd like to expand this a little bit to groups, especially being gay myself, minority groups of forgiveness and acceptance, and without attacking other minority groups, I think, and I'm going to watch myself very carefully here, I think there are groups that have, for one reason or another, refused to forgive at a time when it would have been beneficial for them to try. And I will say this, the Black Panthers, there have been a lot of white involvement in the cause for civil rights, a tremendous amount of white involvement.
Yes.
And the Black Panthers and the militancy of some of these groups, and I'm not passing judgment on them, I'm just saying that alienated a lot of support. And as a gay person, I see that right now that we're winning on a lot of fronts, not on all fronts. And I'm circling around. The question is, when does a group decide? And who decides? And can you make that decision on yourself, on your own? I don't know. A lot of questions there I'm throwing at you.
Yes. as a result of my reading and study, I think I'm most familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in South Africa, in which the whole nation began to address the damage caused by apartheid, and also to explore the possibility of black people as a whole community forgiving white people for what was done to them on a systematic basis over many years. I also think about this problem in relation most recently to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I don't know for sure if groups can forgive groups. It depends a lot on how we define the individual and the group. In the case of South Africa, Africans have the concept of Ubuntu, which essentially means that I am a person only because I am a member of a community. I am a person with this community of people. And without that community, I am not a person. So having that strong collective sense, it might be possible to speak of group forgiveness in South Africa. In the United States, where we're much more individualistic, one might even say atomistic, that seems much more problematic because we don't have that concept of the whole community being a living, vital organism that can be hurt by other groups and individuals and can forgive and heal as a group.
In my gay community activities, I stress the local over the national,
Yeah.
or even the state. Local communities can make an adaptation perhaps that the rest of the nation might not, or other
Yes.
communities might not.
That really makes sense to me.
As I've done a lot of work in the community building, whatever you want to call it, publishing gay papers and things, I have found, and it rather surprised me, how much support there is from a lot of straight people.
Yeah.
And I've gotten to the point now where I assume that if I'm dealing with someone straight, that they're going to be supportive. I find that, at least in this town, that the unsupportive are the exception rather than the rule. On the other hand, I know a lot of gay people who have been victimized from childhood. You know, perhaps they were small or effeminate and they got beat up all the time, and they really don't trust straight people. I have an Indian friend who tells me that she hated every white man until she was in her early 20s. Do you have any advice for those individuals within a group on making peace with?
Well, I'm not sure that I have advice. My experience tells me that recognizing their own feelings about what happened to them is crucial. Honoring themselves, respecting their own experience is crucial. If they are inclined to move toward forgiveness, then it can often be helpful to realize how their mistreatment comes out of fear on the part of the person who hurt them. And in the recognition of that, a measure of kindness can be found for people who hurt us.
To relieve some of the fear.
Yeah, well, to recognize that the mistreatment comes out of fear. Yeah, you know,
let's clarify that. Maybe my
Sure.
mind was wandering. It's the person who is victimizing you
Right,
is doing it out of fear.
Right,
Of,
right.
of your differentness.
right. Our differentness becomes a threat to someone else, and as they feel that threat, they go through an experience of fear, and out of that fear begin to mistreat us. And once we realize that, oh, this person who hurt me was actually afraid of my differentness, then it's easier to recover a measure of kindness toward them. But none of that is meant to shortcut the feelings of anger and the sense of injustice that a person might also feel. For example, I'm in conversation right now with Deborah Pace, who is a counselor working on the Blood Indian Reserve in Canada. And she is telling me, as she develops a program of forgiveness and reconciliation for her people, that she's utterly convinced that they have to find a way to express their anger over what happened to them in the boarding schools in Canada when they were children before they can forgive. And if they can't forgive, then they will not be able to move forward in a healthier way. But she is seeing over and over that they've got to find a way to recognize their own anger about what was done to them. That's a very legitimate part of the process.
We had, I know with the Indians, we had an expression of anger back in the, was it 70s?
I think so.
It was when they
At
took
Wounded
over
Knee.
Alcatraz.
Oh, sure.
And there was Wounded Knee and da-da-da-da.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that sometimes expressing the anger can be counterproductive.
Well, it can.
I mean, you're saying we need it, but
yeah. It can provoke another reaction on the part of powerful people who hurt them in the first place. But one of the things that Deborah taught me that was very helpful was that as a result of the boarding school experience, Indian children were taught not to feel and to not honor the feelings that they had. That was,
yeah.
Again, because the schools feared the loss of control if their students felt their own feelings. Well, sometimes the acknowledgement of anger doesn't necessarily have to be expressed in civil disobedience or a very public demonstration. It may be enough just to acknowledge internally that I am mad over what was done to me. That may be enough, acknowledging the anger on that level.
What is strange is that these groups, is that somehow we act, what do I want to say, within them in a way. You talk about fear. We're not feeling, we don't beat up on the little effeminate kid because we're afraid of him. We're afraid of a whole wide thing of homosexuality.
Right.
We're not afraid of one Indian. It's this concept of them as a group. And,
And that's why I think this whole business of conversation is so important, because we begin to see people not as members of a particular group, but as individuals, complex images and beings. And it's in the recognition that we are individuals that the mystique around a group identity begins to soften.
I'm going to go take this one step further, and maybe I shouldn't. Forgiveness implies right and wrong. Right and wrong imply moral order. And you and I belong to the same church. Somewhere, perhaps, maybe we should mention God in this. Is forgiveness something that we do because it's good for us, makes life easier, or do you feel that there is that it's a reflection of something about the nature of the universe? I'm going way out on a limb here, but forgive us our trespasses. We're asking God to forgive us.
Yes. And the rest of the prayer, refers to, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So the prayer includes a sense of responsibility to forgive as well as the request for forgiveness.
That's there. It's right there. There is a reflection. We ask for forgiveness there, and therefore we accept a responsibility to forgive.
I'm not saying that
people.
God's forgiveness is necessarily conditional, but I am saying that there is a responsibility to be a forgiving people if we are to ask for forgiveness at the same time.
Gary, I want to thank you very much for coming
Oh.
and fulfilling, not exactly a fantasy, but something I've wanted to do for a long time.
Thank you for inviting me, Greg. It was
Okay.
a pleasure.